who wants this. Hello and welcome to the first session of the seminar, Post-Medieval Derangements, taught by Thomas Mical. In this experimental seminar, we explore a wide range of derangements through text about mental and spatial practices strongly influenced by reconsideration of the post-medieval mind and post-medieval spaces as reciprocating mechanisms. The figure of the cornucopia, horn of plenty, will recur axiomatically throughout the seminar as the exceptional discursive figure of hyper-desire, excess, wild production, excessive proliferation, as well as profusion and pleroma. Fundamentally, we will expand the potentialities of a recurring medieval derangement of thought in our late modernity, new dark ages, traced through selected cases of obscure philosophy with populist psychic fiction films, all for delivering desiring production of alien temporalities and alien forms of thought for consideration. These include some examples of how untethering the linear mind of reason in favor of the medieval and surreal divergences can be made possible. Thomas Mical is a professor of architectural theory and has nomadically taught the history of modern thought in architecture, medieval surrealism, science fiction, film theory, all sorts of diagrammatology, and curious transdisciplinary doctoral design research methods for many decades in the US, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, EU, China, and India. He is currently writing a retrospective theory fiction monograph titled Schizoadventures in the Mechanic Phylum, Landscape, Desire, Synchronicity. Since the pandemic, he has experimented with several initiatives such as Pataphysician on call at Living Midnight Narrative Outfit, India, as researcher with Extraordinary Experimental Lab, UK, as adjunct professor, National Institute of Advanced Studies, Bangalore Center for Consciousness Studies in India, teaching with the New Center for Research and Practice based in the US, and continuing a book series editor for Architectural Intelligence with Brill in Netherlands. Thomas, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Matthias. And I just wanted to let everyone know I'm very happy to be covering this relatively unusual course. I've been cooking it for over a year now, and it will be perhaps quite fast-paced and deliberately fragmented. You'll notice that from the readings. Those of you who've looked at the readings, most of the readings are, for example, just 3 or 4 pages from different texts as well. What we're going to be looking at is different types of convergences of medieval thought, aspects of medieval thought, as it in some ways aligns with some post-humanist and contemporary theories around the idea of the structure of reality and consciousness and how we come to know those, with a particular emphasis on surrealism. My background is very much in the history and theory of surrealist thought and practice. I'm just going to, I tend to show a lot of images, including diagrams. I tend to talk fast. I'm from Chicago, and that's the way we do it. I'm happy to say I'm broadcasting live from India, the only country where people have not complained that I talk fast. So I'm pretty happy to be here. And I'm going to hopefully throw a lot of different things at you to consider and to evaluate, both with the readings and with the presentations that I'm doing in class. I don't expect you to buy into everything that you're being exposed to. I would like you to be somewhat of a grazer and pick and choose things you find interesting and find connections between them, because that's actually what we're going to look at in the structure of how you create hybrid thought systems from different fragments. So that's one of the agendas for the course. But I'm going to load up my presentation. My architectural training, we don't think without images. Let me get that going. And I think everyone can see that. Yep. All right, great. Okay, so let me just jump right into it. So this is a idea of what I think we're going to be covering the first course here. Next week, because of the Thanksgiving break in the States, we're not meeting, so our second class will actually be in 2 weeks from now. So there'll be some time to ruminate over some of the material that I'm showing you. Just a little bit of background for those that are curious, my own bio data. I have a lot of degrees in architecture, architectural theory in particular. My minor as an undergrad was in psychology. For a master's at Harvard, my minor was film studies, and for my PhD, I did minors in art history and also in philosophy, continental philosophy. So I kind of graze around the humanities. I've been very interested from, this is my end of year exhibition protest project we did when I finished my bachelor's degree at the University of Florida, where we constructed an observation tower out of salvaged materials using a type of a bricolage technique. Most of my research that I did early in my academic career, and I've been basically kindergarten through PhD and then professor 6 weeks after that. And right now I'm just kind of figuring out what comes after that point. But surrealism in thought and practice, and looking at different components of surrealism, which is quite a diverse avant-garde movement in the interwar period, but more, I think significantly, a lot of research has been done on not just global surrealisms, but surrealism's presence, having to do with everything from precision and the irrational to the significance of dream states as an expanded definition of what constitutes surrealism, and particularly how this gives us ways to come up with new structures of thought, new forms of concept generation, and also how this feeds into irrational but precise forms of creative practice. And one of my incarnations as an academic, I was the head of School of Art and Design at Auckland University of Technology in New Zealand, where I spent a great deal of time actually appreciating the sophisticated ecologies, both physical. New Zealand has all but 3 of the world's ecosystems in a very compact landmass, but also the idea. I started to develop the idea of looking at soft machines, a permutation perhaps of William Burroughs' novel, but specifically the idea that in some ways that mechanisms and organisms are not so distinctly different from each other. And in some ways also the cosmological or the mythological are equal forces of agency along with desire and production in not just that environment, but our understanding and the relationship, that complex, fascinating screen-like interface between our sense of perception and natural systems, even as they start to develop their own forms of, I guess, consciousness, or in some cases, biosemiotics. I briefly taught an experimental doctoral program in India, which was shut down after a couple of years for lots of controversial reasons. And now I think they're just some bald guys decided it was better to study air pollution, so that's kind of gone away. But I've taught a lot of courses in what I call the spatial arts, which would include things such as cinema, performance, not specifically a particular design discipline, but thinking about design as it mutates and across different types and registers of, I guess, spatial conditions and multiplicity of environments, and how this produces multiple forms of subjectivity. So that was the basis for a lot of the courses I taught, what I call design intelligence. And right now, my new fun project on the right, I've taken my vast book collection and basically just made my own library. So I'm somewhere between hopefully Bataille and Borges in the Himalayas with my esoteric library of the Congo Valley. Next year we'll have some visiting fellowships available, but working on a lot of these obscure texts that you heard in my introduction, and also piecing together from multiple fragments both explicit and secret coded messages from my conversants, which tend to be mostly dead philosophers, to try to find out secret connections and relationships between discrete and different ideas from different periods and how we can recombine them. So that's kind of what I'm going to try to show you by example, but also hopefully through the readings as well in this class, is that syncretic or that synthetic approach towards concept building as well as world building. So just to break the ice, that's me. And if you don't want to answer this question, or if you want to type it in chat and not do it verbally, that's fine. But I'm just curious. I'm not going to ask people where you are or what you're working on, because I know most of you know each other already, and I'm the odd one out that way. But something much more pointed and precise. What do you think is the most medieval thing about you? Just off the top of your head. Don't overthink it. It could be something you do, something you think, something you have. What sort of medieval cred do you? Chat. Ah, the monastic retreat. Brilliant.
I'm kind of obsessed with horses.
Oh, really?
Oh, big time, yeah. And not in like quite a surface level way, but they occupy a lot of my mind.
Well, you definitely have to nurture that obsession so that it can grow and overwhelm you. Does anyone else have any medieval capacities or interests?
I too have a preference for grotesque, especially on writing. I like to write like a assemble of a multiplication of things, especially weird things. So this is my medieval thing.
I like that. There's actually a scholarly tradition before the scholasticists, and you find this in a lot of Andalusian and writing of compilations where people just compile, similarities, anecdotes, and things around some topic without any sort of resolution or attempt to integrate it. And I think that has something to do with, say, the development of the chiaroscuro and the florid Baroque styles that came out of Spain as part of the Counter-Reformation. I think there's a direct correlation between that inability to say it one way and that brilliant persistence of the grotesque. Okay, we have biblical stories. The Bible as literature. We'll talk a lot about that, I think, in the third lecture or the third presentation. I'm seeing one about the catastrophic history of society. Yeah, that's my friend Jason and the urbanomic crowd. As you know, the apocalypse is being incredibly well analyzed right now. Jason Mahogany, he runs the.
I like the way that you organized things. I mean, like you can find in our book the mineral in the section of animals.
Yeah.
I like that. I really love that as my favorite thing.
The categories, the compulsion to categorize, and then the slipperiness that allows you to, as Foucault said in the table of species, man is always exempt until the Enlightenment. We'll look at a diagram that explains that. But also, if you know, probably the Borges Chinese Encyclopedia that is at the introduction of Foucault's order of things, the irrational, but also the precision of it, right? And I think, there is something very medieval about that too, the compulsion to order, but also this, tolerance or maybe love of exceptions.
Well, I like the dragon's blood thing. Well, I talked about later.
There's this video game that I played which is set in the Middle Ages, and you play as an artist, like a journeyman artist from Nuremberg. And it was really cool. You got to explore different art styles and sort of immerse yourself in their way of living. So that's one medieval thing that I like.
Yeah, that whole the guild structure. I've studied that both in art history and in architecture, and the journeyman phase is actually in many ways the basis for a lot of higher education as it became codified, as you know, because you had to leave your home guild and go somewhere usually for 2 years to learn new techniques. And there's arguments the spread of the Gothic and the pointed arch came out of those exposures. And I knew scholars who had tracked the movement of one artist from place to place because of the chips in their tools and how it would leave a certain, very fine serration on the stones they carved and of that nature too. So this idea of the traveling, almost the nomadism or the troubadour component, because troubadours were always not just performers but spies. They always brought things back.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's a really important part of the journeyman. You don't simply go out and try new things. You're a sponge and you bring things back.
Well, we have residencies now. That's the modern day journey out.
Yeah, that's what we're trying to get started. We think we're going to have those starting in the Himalayas too. We always tell people, if you can come there, we can take care of you pretty easily. Yeah,
I'm in Mumbai, so I feel like it would be close for me compared to other people here, probably.
Yeah. I just had my son come from Australia actually and came on stage with us in the Himalayas. He loved it. I'm going to go through a couple more of these. The difference between sleeping and being awake. We will cover that extensively because that's actually one of the core definitions that Breton used in the Surrealist manifestos to define surrealism's relationship to reality. Obsession with different cosmological schemes of the body and speculate. Yep, right up my alley. An inexhaustible and fascinating topic. Monstrous entities. Yeah, I think it's time also for us to, particularly with our current apocalypse and our plagues and all of our other revivals of the Dark Ages. And that's one of my arguments, that we actually might be in another Dark Age, but we just don't know it yet. Monster theory needs some serious upgrading as a consequence of post-humans. That too. Magical thoughts and rituals. Great. We got a lot of interest in enchantment, and even with the new materialists, Bennett's book, for example, about re-enchantment as a way of sliding into repair cultures. Apocalyptic teleologies, drowning coastal cities, the return of the flood. Again, very, very common biblical narrative that comes back. So this is fantastic. So everyone's got at least some sort of latent capacity or interest in some aspect of medievalism. And I hope to energize that a little bit and give you some opportunities to perhaps also feel empowered to draw your own inferences, adapt freely from the range of medieval and surreal sources I'll show you, and to maybe not search for truth, but to perform perhaps more as a, there was an old argument that was made during the Enlightenment that scientists have to demonstrate, and mathematicians have to demonstrate and prove truths. People in the professions, including the creative professions, don't have that same criteria. What we do is we demonstrate. So you can say, come gentlemen, let me demonstrate hypnosis. And that's the standard of expertise as well. So hopefully I will give you some variety of tools, and if nothing else, a sense of confidence in the ability to hybridize, blend, combine, fuse things that are inherently unrelated, which is actually incredibly powerful and common medieval thinking. So let's talk about it a little more. The name of the course, it's called version 3 because Jason and I went back and forth about how big to make the course and how esoteric to make it. So this one's called version 3. This is not the third time I've taught it. It was the third proposal that was finally accepted. So I've trimmed out a few things that I'm going to sneak back in there. Don't tell me. Actually, this is recorded. Whoops. All right. Derangements. Let's talk about how derangements might work. Because in a lot of times, derangement is used as a pejorative term. But if you're a committed surrealist like I am, it's a badge of honor to be able to appreciate, understand, recognize, or even utilize derangements. And perhaps the first source that people will know of actually comes from the poet Rimbaud. And he pointed out, as you can see here, the poet as the source of derangement makes himself a visionary through a long, boundless, we'll see that term come up a lot when we talk about pleroma and Neoplatonism, and systematized disorganization of all the senses. This is one really good working explanation of how derangement works. The work of the poet is to disorganize and reorganize through a new system your senses, your sensory perception, sense data, even your pre-reflective consciousness or your unconscious has to be in some ways shaken apart and rebuilt. And he in some of his writings, he talks about something that gets very close to synesthesia, where he sees vowels as different colors and things of that nature. All forms of love, of suffering, madness. He searches himself, he exhausts within himself all poisons and preserves their quintessence. Same way that maybe cockroaches will absorb poison so that their offspring are immune to them, which is why they have to keep upgrading those. Unspeakable torment, where he will need the greatest faith, superhuman strength. Now he sounds like Nietzsche, right? He becomes among all men the great invalid, the great criminal, the great accursed, and therefore the supreme scientist. So this derangement that he's talking about is a derangement of the self through the derangement of sensory perception, but also the way that you use that as powerful tools to destabilize, to disunify. And derangement obviously is very much against the idea of order, organization, and arrangement. Another way to think about derangement actually comes from set theory. There was a brief period of time when I was studying at the European Graduate School, and we had classes in the morning taught by Zizek and classes in the afternoon taught by Alain Badiou, and they were both competing to finish their Deleuze book. This was a long time ago. And so we all had to learn Carnap and in Cantor set theory. In set theory, a deranged set is a group of elements, like in a matrix or a bracketed set, where none of the elements after transformation are in their original position. Derangement is explained as the permutation of the elements of a certain set. And this could be your senses, this could be your concepts, this could be your schematics of how the world is organized, where they move through a transformational process so that no element in the set appears in their original positions. So this is much more of a kind of a logical category of derangement as opposed to a sensory one. So, and then just to add some complexity to it, David Bowie's song "I'm Deranged" is in the soundtrack for David Lynch's Lost Highway, which you can see here, which is a fascinating meditation on dissociative fugues, where the main character has an alter ego and a second entire life as his subconscious plays out, and culminates in this image of the dwelling burning in reverse, something that ties into, I think, anti-Heideggerianism, but also resonates with the Agamben in his book Potentialities, where his first and last sentence in that book, if I remember correctly, argued that the whole entire problem of aesthetics is located in the image of the burning dwelling, which later became an Agamben too. So one aspect of derangement is actually, the fugue state, where you stop being character A and you become character B. And then at some point, and this is also the secret message of Fight Club at the end, where that moment of recognition that A is B, and the destinies of that creates. So that's a different type, and there's other obvious ones. We'll talk a lot about chimeras and hybrids in one of the talks, which is also a different type of biological derangement. So my next question is also, this is perhaps more rhetorical, but just to reflect on it, because we'll come back to this. I think a lot of these things we come back to. You don't really finish with things, and it's not intended to be linear. The PowerPoint does encourage that. So what sort of derangement can you bring to your work? This is a Bruegel's painting called The Magician, where he's demonstrating for different passers-by processes of magic transformation. But think about derangement in the Rimbaud sense, in the set theory sense, or even in the identity, the loss of identity or the disillusion of identity, absorbing yourself into your subconscious perhaps as a surrealist fantasy, but how can you bring types of derangement into your work as opposed to the compulsion for unity, order, the good, the true, and the beautiful in the Platonic sense as something to be disrupted? I should say from metalepsis. Metalepsis is a type of narrative technique where a character, or the author more particularly, moves the discussion or conversation to a higher narrative level. In a sense, this is the goldfish recognizing that there's a world outside the goldfish bowl. And actually, octopi do that. Octopi in captivity are quite notorious for operating outside of their tanks and doing mischief and things of that nature too. Metalepsis is a deliberate transgression between the world of telling and the world of the told. It proposes that even within narrative structures, there are multiple layers of worlds. There's multiple diegetic spaces, the diegetic space being the space that all the characters see and believe. So you can think of it as Bertolt Brecht's idea of breaking the fourth wall, when the actor comes out and says, I am acting and you're watching me act, and shatters that illusion of representation and takes people to a higher level of awareness too. We'll come back to metalepsis because it usually starts with one event, one phrase, one character. Something is off, something is out of place, something unexpected or unusual happens that may not be understandable or even fully cognitively appreciated. But that dissonance, that disturbance, that idea that a weed is a flower out of place, that one element that has been deranged starts to, in some cases, create a cascade effects and start to realize that the world is not as it appears. So that's metalepsis. Story world, diegetic level, that's the world of the characters. You think like Alice in Wonderland. This is not from that story, but it's from a different story. That the Alice in Wonderland story, once she goes down the rabbit hole, is logically consistent. We know that Lewis Carroll was actually explaining algebraic techniques through that book, and it's logically consistent within that world. In science fiction, you would call that a novum, the idea that there's a logically consistent, technologically ordered world that may not be the one we have, but it still has coherence to it. And there is always at least one character that will break through Think of Plato's allegory of the cave too. Someone comes in and says, things are not as they appear, or this one element that is out of order is actually a harbinger or a revelation of a different world. This is a highly, highly medieval way of understanding and appreciating things that in the medieval mind, particularly in the Christian tradition, you couldn't just make sense of things the way we do now. You had to reconcile sense data, logic, and orthodox religious opinion too. So the medieval mind was often negotiating through multiple systems. The closest I can think of is people who can think in multiple languages simultaneously. And the idea that there might be different layers, different registers, or different phase states operating in and around the world which you operate. That's part of the metalepsis. The metalepsis is a rhetorical technique where you break the fourth wall and you announce the constructedness of the environment that you're in, which proposes the possibility of a higher level of awareness or consciousness or another reality outside of the given reality. It was Philip K. Dick who said we're all operating in partially actualized realities, as if we all got our fragments going, and every now and then something will punctuate it from the outside. In metalepsis, the world of the characters and the world of the author usually have a very distinct boundary. And this is something when you have what's called an unreliable narrator, or my favorite, the unstable narrator. This wall between the constructedness and the telling of the story starts to break down too. So in terms of sense perception or autonomous world fragments, the relationship between A and B starts to become in many ways worn thin. You can think of it as a tangency of two different worlds coming into close contact. And often that's a definition for the Gothic itself. When the natural and the supernatural come in close contact, you usually have a Gothic event or Gothic trope happening too. Syncretism is much more religious and philosophical, but it kind of works the same way, at least that's my opinion too. That's where you blend different religious beliefs or philosophies. Syncretism, if you look at the history of religions, particularly Western religions, the adaptation of, say, Persian beliefs into Judeo-Christian beliefs into, say, contemporary technology. There's always this process of syncretism, and some scholars have said, why do we need the term? It's so self-evident that there's no pure state in any religious or philosophical system, that we're always modifying or in some ways blending or combining, picking and choosing between thought systems or understandings of the sacred, and making additions, changes, substitutions. Syncretism is the process where you can take fragments from different worlds. You think of some extreme examples like Blavatsky, when she developed Theosophy, she tried to reconcile everything from Christian Gnosticism to Hindu cosmology and all the other religions as well. Aurobindo does that to some degree with theories of spirit and theories of mind. And this syncretic impulse is a very medieval impulse, which is to combine the useful fragments from the past with novelty, insight, eccentricities, the irregular, or as some of you have pointed out, the monstrous, bringing the monstrous into an ordered system, and to try to use that to create a new, more robust system. So syncretism, yes, we're all guilty of it, because in some ways you could argue we all practice different forms of philosophical or theological systems that are not in the pure state that we were taught, and even the person teaching them is going to be slightly out of dogmatic precision, off trend, as they say in the fashion industry. And as a consequence of that, what we have is a whole bunch of very, very interesting and subtle permutations, mutations, deviations. And that's okay, because in some ways you have to take ownership and make sense of the systems you're looking at. But one of the powers of studying medieval thought is, aside from the incredible exhaustiveness in the later medieval period, the belief that things are more complex than they appear seems to run through a lot of medieval philosophy as well as medieval aesthetics. So semiotics, for example, in the case of Umberto Eco, quite rich because everything has connotations and denotations, but it also has context. And when you take something out of its context, then you start to produce a new destabilizing range of derangements or permutations. I'm trying to think, it was Dostoevsky who said there's only two great stories in the world. A man goes out to see the world, or a stranger comes to town, and it's the same story. So a lot of this has to do with this idea also of not just sense making, but world world building, around sense making. Syncretism is a very powerful tool because it allows you to combine the incommensurate, the things that you like, as opposed to the strict orthodox dogmatic expectation of what sort of progress might be available. Look, for example, Paul North's clever book, Bizarre Privileged Items in the Universe, based on Roger Bois' surrealist anthropology, where he tries to get rid of the whole idea of difference, which is one of the fundamental components of metaphysics, where we have identity and difference, and saying, what if we had a metaphysics based on the idea of likeness? This is like that. That paper and butterflies are alike in certain capacities. And as a consequence, his text here delves very much into early medieval thought too, to find states of mind where this was still the case. Going back to Plotinus and some of the other scholars we'll be looking at in some capacity. But the idea non-coincidence, multiplicity, and the idea that these linkages are bizarre, but they're also privileged because they start to produce other meanings and other effects too. Back to poetry, but tie an inner experience, which in some ways is a meditation on self-reflection, but also strongly influenced by Nietzsche and Nietzsche's attempt to find a more aesthetic version of this vitalism to counter the dumbing down of modernity he was witnessing in the late 19th century. The poetry introduces the strange, and we'll keep coming back to this term a lot, because making something strange, not just as a Russian formalist technique, Astronani, I think it was called, the idea of defamiliarizing something as a way of producing a radical poetic movement in Russian formalist thought. The difference between, this is Shklovsky and others, poetry and literature are distinctly separate from everyday prose or conversation or, IKEA instructions, because they defamiliarize. They make this thing strange, particularly they make the familiar strange, which is also Freud's definition of the uncanny. So there's a lot of this happening in the early 20th century as forces of modernity start to create radical transformations following the law of unintended consequences in high modernity, as it was called. We start to see this kind of reciprocating backlash, or this undertow, things increasingly becoming more uncanny or becoming increasingly strange as a raw source material, perhaps for not just aesthetic understanding, but also cognitive and spiritual understanding too. And you can see the familiar dissolving into the strange. And he talks about this as, particularly in his understandings of the boundary between the known world and the system of non-known, which is what's called, as he developed in his later. One of the sets of readings, which is quite obscure, that I gave you was about Gnostic theories of time. I'm going to pop into that briefly now, just to get a little more of a philosophical grounding, to add almost a temporal component to this idea of derangement or the making strange. In Alfred Gell's fascinating writings on anthropology, and he argued that there is no art. Art is basically the works of a occult technician that produce effects at a distance. He was looking primarily at the Pacific Ocean artistic practices, not Western gallery practices. But he drew very heavily on the phenomenologist Searle, and here you can see one of Searle's diagrams, where at the top, it's a little difficult to unpack, but your consciousness is moving through time, at least in this transcendental phenomenology that Searle was talking about. And so as you move from a point A in time to a point B to a point C, you can start to see it as a succession of moments or a succession of experiences. You can think of a filmic sequence, for example, if you want to be more like Henri Bergson and his understanding of perception. But there's this idea, there's this movement. And the past, in many ways, seems to recede from us, and the future seems to come to us. And that's what's happening underneath there. But you start to see it's almost like this complex, a hyper version of the game Pong or something, where there's multiple what are called protensions, which are forces in the future coming to the present, which is a little difficult to grasp, but quite important. And there are retensions, things that happen to you that go into the past that you still have access to. And they start to create a meshwork. They start to interact and interplay with each other. So you don't simply float along the top like our goldfish with a 6-second attention span and go from moment A to moment B or moment C. each of those moments has within it this whole cluster of different forces pushing and pulling it, getting signals both from the future and recognitions or from the past. So clairvoyance and nostalgia are on an equal plane in terms of affecting or forming the present. And we'll come back to this because this is a highly, highly medieval and Gnostic understanding of temporality. In its extreme form, and we'll see an example of this later, it means there actually is no present time. There's a corollary that says there is no past or future, there's only the present. And both of these are based on this dynamic model that neither the past, the future, or the present are static or have clear boundaries, but in many ways they're force fields interacting with each other. You'll find in, say, for example, Deleuze's logic of sense, where he analyzes the different types of mathematical series that occur in Alice in Wonderland, which I think is probably in the top two books of theory fiction for me, Zarathustra and Alice in Wonderland. Someday I'm going to write a mashup of Zarathustra and Wonderland. I might talk Jason into doing that. But he makes a distinction between two very archaic notions of time that often coexist. Like in Egyptian time, there was the day-to-day life, and then there was a time of eternity that was even beyond the gods' capacity to control and constrain it too. So the Egyptians had radical separation of two types of temporality. Coming with this is a Stoic model, so this comes in the Roman times, so roughly the same time that Gnosticism was developing. Aeon and Chronos as two different forces of time operating in the same subjects in the same environments. So you can think of it as not having like two different watches from two different time zones, but having two different types of time consciousness within your own mind, and how that can potentially create a great field of dissonance or derangement, especially when they're out of it. So the two readings of time in Ion, as you can see, incorporeal effects, it eludes the present by flying in both the past and future directions at once. So there's almost like an absent presence in the idea of the time of Ion. And Sion represents often cyclical time or looping time. The loops and coils, like the coils of snakes and Medusa's hair, have something of this, that trying to capture something that's lively and moving and always shifting and freezing it into a statue, like being petrified as Medusa's gaze would give you. That is the moment that Ion becomes Chronos. And Chronos is the present unity of bodies in space and time. And this is that linear perception. This is the goldfish model. You go from sequence to sequence, event to event. As my Russian landlord said when I was in Berlin, there's meals, and then there's the next meal, and then there's the next meal. Just this sequence of meals and events, which tends to be much more corporeal. So Chronos and chronological time, my friend calls it the land of timetables. That's very different and distinct from Aeon, which is a much more wild and difficult to apprehend or even perceive understanding of time. And often a lot of the work that's being done in quantum mechanics tends to favor the incorporeal effects. And again, quantum mechanics would be a very fine scale in units of time that we can't even perceive or measure, whereas our cognitive apparatus, our time consciousness, is very much tied to the corporeal, to the actual physical body and the physical cycles. But it also, between the two, you can also think about that. This is an argument that I'm making by looking at phenomenology as well as contrasting it with Gnosticism, is that the unconscious doesn't really follow Chronos. Your unconscious is much more like Ion, where nostalgia and clairvoyance can coexist. You can have deja vu experiences in the same way you can just have galloping memory recalls too. In some Gnostic systems, there's also Kairos, which is the time that is both Chronos and Aeon, something that allows us to reconcile these two incommensurate time systems, and it forms the basis for consciousness itself. What the Jungians would call the Ouroboros, the snake eating its own tail, is much closer to this idea of the Kairos, where the linear and circular condense into a persistent, not consistent, but persistent consciousness. One of my favorite ideas, and I love about science fiction films. If you think about, say, speculative futures, strategic foresight, some of the disciplines that are taught in design and management about trying to anticipate future states, future conditions, whether they're possible, probable, or impossible. You also think of it in terms of metaverses and alternate worlds, that you're in the present, right? How many Lokis are there? One apparently is crocodile, which is really cool. There can be multiple cells, but also there's multiple futures, or the appearance of multiple futures from any fixed point or lens in the present. And we see them in a lot of those tactical disciplines like design and management. We often see those as presented as cones that are open. You can also see the kind of tentacular, to use the Cthulhu term, tentacular spreading out of possible futures simultaneously. But what happens when the future starts to actually form the present? Because we always think that the memory, Bressanian cone of perception, that our past experiences are pressing down and forming our present. This is also a Freudian argument in the sense that our subconscious tells us what we see in the present, how to screen it. But what happens if the other case is true? Now, this is actually very tied very heavily to a lot of Christian theology and a lot of populism too. The Book of Revelations and the Book of Genesis bookend the convention, the formatted Bible. There's a lot of texts that are excluded from it. So the Book of Revelations and then set up in response to that Alpha Omega. And in the Book of Revelations, all of these final steps are predetermined and actually forming the present too. Another way to think about that, if you saw the film Tenet, the palindrome, where time is like these two cones, the palindrome in the sense of chronological, or the past is just the residue of the future, which is influencing the present. And in some ways reversing our conventional understanding of linear time and causality, and having the future as the dynamic force, in some ways the subconscious or God, depending on which theological, psychological, system you're using, whatever that X unknown that is driving your consciousness without you being aware of it, those being located in a position that is not the present. If you think of our ion model, if it's in the past or the future, it creates a very rich understanding, I think, in dynamism, where things are never fixed. Things are never stable. Things can never be static. Essence itself is called into question, which challenges a lot of the Platonic principles, because it creates a system of dynamic, constant becoming and change, transformation. You can see it's called cataclysm now, but that is the idea that the unknown future is actually known in certain capacities and possibly could be not just shaping the present, but is already embedded itself in the past and bypassed too. All time is affecting all time, all the time. Probably the most clever way I found someone to describe this phenomenon, which in many ways is a temporality that is away from the mechanisms of measurement. Lewis Mumford pointed out that the clock, and particularly the time clock used in capitalist production, originated at least in the West, in the monasteries, where there was a required number of prayers that had to be said at specific times of the day. So the metrification of time was a consequence of a spiritual need to pray correctly at the correct time. And that also, Mumford also points out that starts in progress, not just industrialization, but the entire mechanosphere, where we start to use prosthetic elements and devices long before Simondon was writing, as extensions of our own psyche and intelligence too. But this is also important to think about temporality as something that is reversible. But we can also think of it as something that comes far out and back in a way. So this is a really funky diagram from an essay called Three Presents, Temporality of Territorial Production. It's an analysis of a very obscure architect named John Sohn. But you can see the horizon of events. There's a book by Paul Virilio once where he called something called The Landscape of Events. And he said, if you were God, there would be no past, present, and future. Everything is already predetermined and evident, and things would cohabit the same spaces, but at different times simultaneously. So like a Victorian seeing ghosts of the past and future, he said in The Landscape of Events, for God, there is no temporal component. It is all self-evident and present all the time. So the horizon of the event is very much our hermeneutic horizon, our boundary condition of those things that we can sense or perceive with our limited cognitive apparatus. And you can see in this very cool diagram, the swing of Chronos, as you can see, lines of actualizations, crowds of virtualities, leading to particular instants. And this is the idea that in every moment or in every instant, multiple temporalities or multiple cause-effect relationships are giving the appearance of coincidence or simultaneity or causality, but that might not be the case. It might just be a perception. And then coming to strike us from far outside of that is the cycle of Chronos, if you remember, a deeper understanding of this time that moves beyond the instance and tries to formalize it. And I was just, there's a little bit of sarcasm. This diagram reminds me so much of the anglerfish, if you saw Finding Nemo. I told one of the anglerfish in there too, that Chronos always seems to come back and interrupt this process of this perpetual, occupation and habitation and deferment of the instant as this exterior, non-subjected time comes back and imposes itself across us. I mentioned in one of the texts as well that if you're familiar with Renee Tom's catastrophe theory, which he uses a mathematical model to look at, say, crisis situations when a dog is being stressed, for example, its fight or flight reaction, or the nervous breakdown, or some other unexpected conditions can happen when there's too many stresses simultaneously. This is technically a hypersensitive situation that is he calls it a catastrophe. Mathematically find a way to model these unstable states and the catastrophic jump that happens when these bifurcations happen. So he used actually the idea of a piece of paper with a fold in it, and this is long before Deleuze was writing his book about Leibniz and Baroque and fold, with the idea that even in our surface of stable states, things can become unstable from unseen or seen forces, or the relationship between these forces. And that's the really important thing to keep in mind, because that's the basis for not just process philosophy, the hidden relationship between apparently dissimilar visible and invisible things, but is also a foundational principle for a lot of the philosophy and theology we're looking at from the early medieval period too, where there's a deep assumption that all of this is preordained or has meaning, and that the causality is always for a greater good. Whereas in catastrophe theory, stuff happens, and in retrospect, you can figure out how and why the catastrophe happened, but leading up to it, you can't perceive it until that radical change of states occurs. Now, in Gnostic time, what we've got here is there's basically Gnosticism is a dualist belief system that was roughly contemporaneous with early Christianity, and it was a heresy. And it's got a couple of modifications of both Judaism as well as Christianity in it. I won't go into all of the components of this, but just to basically explain, let's look at the top part. There is the material cosmos on the right. And that is the world of matter, the world of immanence. That is the world of observable phenomena. This one's mapping out a lot of Christian theology onto it, with the idea that there's the material world that in some ways appears complete and self-evident. And then there's this weird boundary, this vertical boundary. And then on the left is something that comes from Neoplatonism, the idea of the pleroma. The pleroma is a fascinating construct of a metaphysical world beyond the given. Now, Nietzsche writes great tracts about this, arguing for the non-existence of the metaphysical world or any sort of metaphysical explanations or justifications. Whereas in early Christian, Gnostic, and early medieval thought, even as Gnosticism, for example, Sufism, the idea of there being an indescribable, unknowable, vast realm beyond the material realm as a promise of either salvation or enlightenment. It creates a system that we call dualism. So you have the material and the spiritual. The challenge is always, what is their relationship? If you're in one, can you prove the existence of the other? So this is the classical Gnostic structure. So what's most interesting about this, whether you're most people would be materialists now, very few people would be into transcendental knowledges or metaphysical systems. It's definitely a fashion, but sometimes it's coming back a bit. But what's really interesting about this diagram, it's not asking you to believe it or accept it, is let's look at something very precise, the boundary between them. That part of the metaphysical dualist system of Gnosticism is that people don't know or can't know about the existence of the world beyond the world, the timeless world, as opposed to the timetable world, because there's these active forces holding them down, pressurizing them, focusing them on the everyday material realm, and turning them quite literally away from enlightenment. So you can see how Plato's allegory of the cave is foundational for this understanding of the pleroma, the enlightenment, the realm of pure light in a world that's seen as a world of darkness. And two very Gnostic responses to this were to try to, through revelation, through epiphanies, through a series of increasingly ritual practices, access the supernatural or the divine as a way of transcending beyond the material, which made the material seem very base and very crude and very unnecessary and in some cases evil. Some Gnostics said, yes, the material world is evil and keeps us away from the true God, because in Gnosticism, the material world was made by a lesser evil God to deceive us and make us think that that's all there is. And one of the consequences of that, some Gnostics would just disavow any sort of pleasure, any sort of material immersion, and withdraw and seek pure enlightenment. But there is an opposite strain, and this is the one that George Bataille talks a lot about in his work on Gnostic materialism, which was, well, if this real world is a fake world, or a given world is not the real world, we can pretty much, do all the transgressions and sins that we want, because the transcendent world doesn't acknowledge it, and there's no correlation between either. This is the big schism with Christianity too. That, there is an afterlife, but your performance in one world dictates your status in the next world. Whereas in Gnosticism, the argument was that everybody has an element of the divine, and they've been separated. They're being pressed down by these things called aeons, or archons in some of the writing, and that you're being prevented from knowing about metaphysics and transcendence and divinity and the sacred because of all of these forces. And it was a very powerful argument. And as I said, it created a huge controversy and heresy in early Christianity. Plotinus was actually, they think, we'll talk a little bit about his theories, because he's one of the first to develop a theory of psychology, the idea of the bifurcated soul, for example. But this is a bifurcated world. It's a world where the divine and a world where the base matter have almost nothing in common except for a little part of your consciousness that twinges every now and then and you recognize something as being or belonging to the sacred. So my favorite illustration of this is from a French woodcut coming much later. You can see the son there looking slightly concerned. Most of you, that's the look of the parent when the kid's about to put the fork in the electric outlet. Right? The benevolent son's like, okay, I'm just going to watch this, see how it goes. And, that's us. That is our, that's the mage or the scholar going to the end of the celestial spheres, quite literally, with the idea that the earth is one sphere and then each of the planets creates a sphere. And there's a musical harmony of the spheres that if you're enlightened, you can hear those. It's a medieval cosmological model once, heliocentrism became established. And the question, the typical, the emperor has no clothes type of kid question is, what happens if I go outside of the sphere? What do we find? And so this is your philosopher, this is your artist, this is your seeker, who's quite literally in this fascinating, this is a great meme from about 1200, putting their head out and saying, okay, what's beyond the sensible realm? And as you can see there, the representation is there's other realms, there's actually multiple realms there. There's this idea of this stratification or these multiple layers of reality is one of the strong legacies of the medieval period that only gets, again, flattened and suppressed in high modernity. You see something in chat? Hold on. Okay.
Yeah, I was just noticing that sometimes when you're speaking away from the microphone, we can't hear you well.
All right, I will try to get a little closer to my overheating Mac. Okay.
Sorry.
That's all right. One of the essays I gave was from Angeliki and their special issue on xenofeminism. And if you're interested in that, the essay on platform cosmologies, I just want to talk a little bit again about this, leading into this idea. The universe, or the cosmology, which is both the material, the mental, and the spiritual, which would be the three conventional components of early medieval thought, at least in the Christian tradition, and particularly in philosophy. The Gnostic cosmos, as you can see here, the pleroma is above, and the lower aeons here, Haramene, or the material world, is underneath. So this is actually very much influenced by Neoplatonism too, that there's a higher level and a lower order. In Plato, you might recall that in the ideal city, in Platonism, run by philosopher kings, they banished the artists immediately because of their ability to lie. Plato hated the sophists because of their beautiful lies. In the Platonic system, the more mathematically pure, the more closer it is to the realm of the forms, which are timeless and eternal. Whereas things that are time-based or material decay, have imperfections, and for Plato, God forbid, the only thing worse than a carpenter is a painter who paints chairs, because that's three removed from reality in the Platonic system. So that gets echoed also in these models. On the left is actually part of the Dead Sea Scrolls, where all of these lost models, cosmological and theological systems, were lost as they were banned as apocrypha and hidden as they were excluded from the Bible. Those discovered actually in the 20th century allow, I still think it's fascinating that these pieces of parchment eaten away with these text descriptions can become these very sophisticated diagrams and knowledge systems too. The Gnostic cosmos, for all intents and purposes, does not have the concentric quality that we find in, say, Renaissance, Enlightenment, or even modernist models. The Gnostic cosmos, you can think of it as being more bubble-like. It has realms that in some ways have no connection or very minimal points of tangency. So that is the idea that different states of consciousness or different modes of understanding, different aspects of your soul. In Plotinus, you have one part of your soul that's uniquely yours, and that's the one that can get stained by sin and vice. And then there's a part of your soul that's part of the shared collective consciousness and doesn't die and persists. And it's a complex thing to get around. That you have like a permanent and disposable component just of the soul, and then there's the intellect, the sense organs, and things of that nature. But one aspect of the Gnostic cosmos, and this is interesting, I think, for us thinking in terms of everything from syncretism, how this later became organized and dismissed in some ways and hammered down into a clearer cosmology. But in many ways, it is also based on the idea of metalepsis, that having someone in one world poke their head through and see that there's an entirely other world that exists that was invisible the moment before, allows you to start to think about these as maybe chains or even molecular, or as Ed Keller would call it, pocket universes, where one universe just comes into a slight moment of tangency with another universe, and there's a small portal that opens up that allows you to see it. It creates a very robust knowledge system because it doesn't have a totality or a singular schema. It actually sets things up much more, I would argue, again, quoting Agamben, it sets things up much more in the narrative of the adventure. Where understanding or operating within one realm and discovering the existence of the second one is an invitation. And the allegory of Plato's cave, the significant question is, if you escape from the cave and realize the true nature of the universe, do you stay or do you go back and tell the universe? And so this is one of the differences between a mystic and a prophet as well. That ability to come back and tell the others. But one way to think about, and these are some earlier diagrams from earlier treatises, interpreting aspects of certain Gnostic cosmology as discrete and mostly autonomous, incommensurate or non-systematic realms based on adjacency, or a transformation, translation of states of matter to phase spaces. So in the Renaissance, this all changes, right? And this is often how we start to see both star maps and GPS coordinates and things of that nature too. This is from Flood's book, and this is his model of cosmology. Starting at the top, God is still there in the Renaissance, but God is very dutiful and compulsion driven towards order and ordering systems, which leads to knowledge, which is Sophia, very charged figure in Gnostic theology as a deceiver. But in this system, as you can see, the different earthly realms and the celestial realms, everything is ordered. Everything is perfectly concentric and aligned. Everything is in its place. Right? I have OCD family members, and they would love this, right? And I have to say, being trained as an architect, if you have OCD, it's really cool. Actually, architects do really well with it. So that's like the place, we're jam-packed for OCD people. But there's also this compulsion towards order, which the fundamental principles, as we talked about before, about derangement, the process of disruption that comes from events or the moment of metalipsis when you crack the fourth wall. These create a great disturbance, perhaps even trauma, as this organized world starts to crack or starts to crumble. But for the Gnostics, this was seen as the beginning of initiation of the process of knowledge. So in our medieval and I would argue even our post-medieval model here, you can see this is an argument coming from the Neoplatonists and leading up to the Scholastics. The Neoplatonist period was based very much on the idealism of Plato and this dualist world. Aristotle is in many ways much more interested in immanence than in transcendence, and articulating what later became scholasticism, which was the meticulous cataloging of all possible conditions, all possible traits. So what you're looking at is scaffolding systems, thought systems now, where different types of categories and subcategories start to have chains of relationships. So a chain of being is used to describe this in the spiritual sense. But you can see in this diagram, perhaps contrasting the Socratic, the Platonic, and the Aristotelian. And this is a medieval diagram, not a diagram from ancient Greece, where everything is neat and tidied and ordered in increasing degrees of idealism or increasing degrees of distancing from temporal decay or change or transformation, even the whole organization of different plant and animal species under the Aristotelian system, kingdom phylum, and those. All of those are based on hierarchical systems and branches of knowledge, great filing cabinets, basically, where things get filed away in relationships to each other, and everything is part of a category leading to something else. This is a much later medieval model of the universe, as you can see, very different from the early medieval model, Dark Ages, as it's sometimes called incorrectly, that we'll be looking at in this course, where things are not yet tidied and organized and scaffolded in many ways, rearranged. We're much more interested, at least I'm much more interested, in showing before this state occurs, derangement and dissonance and process of estrangement and making strange are the fundamental tools for cognition as well as understanding spirit. And you can find that post-medieval as a term. I'll describe that after the break. I think that's an important term. Here you can see Jacob's ladder, where the ascension to heaven is seen as a process of climbing a ladder. You can see there's devils trying to pull people off of that. The path of righteousness looks a lot like a corporate ladder in the Gothic period of Christianity. And as you can see, it's fraught with a lot of peril. And in some ways, it often has a very clear linear temporal component too. Contrast that with a diagram from Deleuze and Guattari, looking at both the two dominant thought forms of the later 20th century under capitalism, paranoia or schizophrenia. There is no third option in their model. And looking at, in some ways, this binary or this bifurcated mind, a bifurcated soul as a consequence of capitalism. Very quickly cover one of the readings I recommended. It was quite a strange and fascinating book, Deleuze, Guattari, and Schinek in Early Christianity. And it's very helpful, I think, for the conversation to forecast or at least to highlight some of these aspects of creation, but also the rehabilitation of concepts. So some of the concepts that I'm talking about, and they do this in their philosophy a lot too, they will take obscure concept like body without organs came from Artaud and his relationship to describing a world where there's a different God. He gets into a certain Gnostic speculation about there being two different gods, a good God and a bad God. And this idea of rehabilitation of concepts or the creation of concepts is a very powerful and medieval thing to do as well. So it means rebranding, in some cases repurposing, adapting, transforming the concepts. We don't have to always create them. It's not always about the production of the new, but it's making something that was there that may be forgotten, something that was strange, and bringing it back to the table. Is the magician rearranging concepts. And they argue, this is the Deleuze-Guattari themselves arguing that concepts should have necessity and strangeness as their two attributes. So as you develop and make your own concepts, and Deleuze is quite explicit about this, Badiou always argued that philosophers have to produce truth, and he said there's only 4 discourses where they're allowed to produce truth. Badiou's argument. Art, science, politics, and love. For Deleuze, philosophers don't produce truth, they produce concepts, which is actually, Badiou argued, that's an artist's understanding of philosophy, not a philosopher's understanding. So this is an artistic model of the idea of creation, rehabilitation of concepts, so producing concepts in response to new conditions or new situations, so poking your head through the sphere and seeing something you didn't expect, which could be hallucination, could be revelation, it could be a dream. It could be a radical change of environment, going to the Himalayas from somewhere far away. You have the necessity and the strangeness as two drivers for the production of concept. It's like the 2 prongs of the chopsticks holding the grain of rice too. They argue. Plain argues that the totality of all desiring production, those are the 2 operators in Deleuze-Guattari's 1,000 Plateaus, and even more so in the first part of their series, Anti-Oedipus, that all desire is production, and production is based on desire, which is an anti-Marxist, anti-Freudian derangement of capitalism, constitutes a plane of immanence, which is a one-story universe. So their idea of plane of immanence as a one-story universe, and the plane is quite good in this moment. We're pointing out that beyond the plane of immanence, the transcendence is still a possibility. So he goes on in the reading that I gave, because I think I gave a couple pages from this book if you're interested. The transcendence is something like the pleroma outside of immanence, but still creates a pressure that forces the boundary condition of immanence to be known. Here you can see at the bottom in this other diagram kind of about a plane of transcendence. I don't think plane is correct. I think that it should be a boundless area. But the ethical homeostasis is that the pressure that can't get out, which is also one of Nietzsche's arguments for the birth of the soul, is pressures that can't get out of the body to get internalized and become the soul. He points out for machines, desire, and multiplicity are 3 aspects of the same block of becoming. Becoming is used here philosophically to talk about the word of flux. Right? Multiplicity is a multidimensional, dissymmetrical, differentiated field of intensities. We'll come back to this right after the break, which we'll go to. Fields of intensities, flows, events, and processes whose total number of dimensions is always in flux. You can think of it as the Carnivalesque. We'll look at this and look at some post-medieval examples. Look at Hayek and we'll look at Bosch, which comes from that essay that I wrote. Our life world abounds in multiplicities: crabgrass, clouds and crowds, waves and storms, packs of wolves, swarms of rats, colonies of ants, a murmuration of birds, and a legion of demons. These are all multiplicities. That's Deleuze and Guattari themselves. So the idea of even the legions themselves of demons or of angels already have the idea of the multiple, in some ways overwhelming or challenging that attempt towards unity. Each of these different forms of multiplicities are potentially deranging for the ordering system that allows us to recognize them. And then he goes and does a very structuralist thing, compares the old-fashioned, the modern systems on the right and the post-capitalist ones. I'm going to have to get some water. We're going to take a 10-minute break. That's okay with everyone? And go have some caffeine, do some jumping jacks, play with your cat, whatever it takes. Let's clock back in 10, and then I'm going to talk a little bit more about the program. It's all right. All right, I'm back. All right. So it looks like a large majority have come back. That's always a good sign. I'm going to jump back into the presentation, and we're right about halfway through this. We'll have a little bit of time at the end. I want to talk about presentations and the final projects. I've left a little bit of time for that at the end. And also just a reminder that next week there is no class because of the Thanksgiving holidays, I believe. So we have a 2-week or 1-week gap between this class and the next class, which is in December, I think. So this mysterious construct of the pleroma, which has the idea of etymologically fullness, the idea of the divine or the sacred, the transcendent realm, the other world, as Nietzsche would disparagingly call it, as something that is simultaneous but incommensurate with the material or the base world. And you can't think of it as like a sky divinity or a sacred mountain somewhere. It, in many ways, is just an entirely different cosmos adjacent to the material world. George Bataille talked a lot about, as he was developing the idea for his fascinating book on the accursed share, which I was pleased to discover he thought would win a Nobel Prize for economics and anthropology. He developed the idea of Gnostic materialism, which was the idea of this base materialism, and turned to Gnosticism in a very particular way to explain that limit or that boundary condition, the pressing down of the immanent, or you could say the materialist, being pressured and focused towards a closed system. And he says, as you can see here in this quote, Gnosticism and its psychological process is not different from present-day materialism, not as an ontology, but matter as a thing unto itself, and how it exists outside of the consciousness itself. Base matter is external and foreign to ideal human aspirations, and it refuses to allow itself to be reduced to great ontological machines resulting from these aspirations. So Bataille's work on Gnostic materialism highlights those aspects of the entirely unknowable or inaccessible components of the transcendent, which focuses our attention primarily on the material. But he made a distinction as well. I mentioned before there is 2 approaches towards Gnostic practice. And the Bataille one is looking for, in this binary system of this closed system, that high and low, or the base materials of the world, that matter itself is all that there is. And for him, transcendence is something that exists, following Nietzsche, as a fantasy outside of the realm. But he says it's a question of disconcerting the human spirit and idealism before something base, to the extent one recognizes the helplessness of superior principles. And so his attempts, both in his theories, his philosophical work, his surrealist anthropology work, the College of Sociology, the Cephalé, and the work he did with the Documents series, as well as some of his published pornography. Bataille experimented very much with the highs and the lows and transposing them, following a certain surrealist practice too, but always with this boundary condition, or this limit condition, to use Blanchot's term, of that horizon being created or cast, where the transcendent is completely unavailable or inaccessible, and base materialism is all that we have left to work with. In some ways, the only real excess in the system comes from the idea of the sun and his notions of solar expenditure. It's a fascinating topic. The idea of this base, and to use a different, more, I guess, modernist approach of a superstructure, also shows up in Althusser's work. In both of these, there's Kojeve's lectures on Hegel were very influential, as well as on some of the psychoanalysts and surrealists themselves too, where base, or the base world, in Althusser's system, which is highly critical of capitalism as well, points out it's a type of political economy. So I remember having these conversations as a graduate student too, that feudalism has a very different base, economic base than capitalism. And what will replace capitalism as the base? Will a world composed of distributed systems and artificial intelligence be a radically different political economy, or is it just a late capitalist phase? Because one of the consequences of that is, at least in the Althusserian model, the superstructure, which we would think of as all of the things that like Weber and other sociologists studied arising from industrialization at the late 19th, early 20th century, are there like fumes coming off of the machine that the superstructure, whether it's theories, social relationships, new types of practices, all of these are in many ways dependent on the base continuing as the base. So for Bataille, the base materialism had this Gnostic component to it. It could be either high or low, good or bad, but it was always operating within this fixed realm of possibilities. And it was up to human agency to impose those things, that there was no external values or criteria for good and bad or low. That Gnostic materialism was what it was. And in the superstructure model here above the base, you have a whole constellation and cluster of, I guess, social and intellectual infrastructures that are emanating quite literally from the range of capacities or potentialities of the machinic world, as you can see here in this very simplified diagram. This is before the idea of repressive state apparatuses and ideological state apparatuses, which you might be familiar with some of Althusser's work. And he even came in the later period of his life after his mental breakdown and after he murdered his wife, he wrote about aleatory materialism, which is materialism that has no direction, no causality, and in some ways no possibility of historicism as well. So this entire system for him, because of his personal experiences, I think, started to dissolve as well. The Apocryphon of John, which is one of the Dead Sea Scrolls that was discovered, conveys the true nature of divine realm and its relationship to the material cosmic and humanities. The transcendent God, or invisible spirit, is inconceivable and ineffable. And negative theology comes from the fact that you can't actually talk about these things because language and perception are too limited, that you can't even describe them. You can only access them either through feeling or through spiritual resonance or things of that nature. The pleroma, which means full perfection of the divine, is a hierarchical family of personified aeons who emerge as the fruit of the spirit, self-contemplation or self-expression. This means that in all senses of the word, the pleroma is filled with its fullness comes from the fact that it is full of these different manifestations of the divine, and all of them in some ways are acting as border guards on the horizon of the material realm, or the realm of the body and of experience too, and that it takes some very sneaky border crossings to be able to access your upper spirit, to find through self-contemplation, self-expression, access to the idea of this ideal world. Much more simple diagram. The pleroma is the inaccessible realm, the supernatural, the transcendent, the indescribable, uncountable, unknowable, other world of the divine. And then the figure of Sophia, which represents not just wisdom, but divine wisdom, casts a shadow down, which becomes matter. And this is particularly the Bataille idea, I think, of the base matter, which produces a demiurge, which is a divinity, a false divinity that operates only in the material realm. So this would be almost like a machinic god that just does business in and of and around the earth, who manipulates matter to create the earth. So the demiurge was used as a pejorative term in some Gnostic texts to talk about a false god, or a divinity, or a demiurge itself is a type of bad creator who creates a material realm that is the earth, that, as you can see, as this kind of, you see the fish tank here, where everything is happening in the dotted lines of the fish tank of our environment, with an entirely different realm operating above and outside of it. There's a diagram I found of the manifest reality at the bottom, and then as you move farther towards the top, consciousness itself starts to liberate and to escape from base matter and primordial matter and the physical universe, an argument for the idea of the pleroma as being something more like a higher form of consciousness or spiritual attunement, unavailable to particular molecules, chromosomes, and tissues. I just want to highlight Gabriela Catron's Chromatica, one of the more recent books to come out, just from Urbanomic. Just came out a couple of weeks ago, and I just got one of the first copies in India. Unfortunately, it just came 2 days ago, so I haven't finished reading it, but I expect to be an expert on this book the next time I see you, so I'll have more to say about it at that point. But he does argue very much for a new version of transcendence that is based much more on reversing apocalypsism, nihilism, and looking towards more positive, productive, and creative forces. He calls it phenomenondelic pleroma, which sounds a bit like the psychedelic, and we'll talk about that more. The primary element of modern thought into a new configuration, new concepts of a worldless daydream. Sounds echoes of some of the things that the surrealists were talking about too. So you have to hold this space for now. I gave the reading list, the flyers about this, but his idea of this phenomenodelic experience is that it's not simply based on phenomena or materials, but it always, as he says the book itself is a nautilus thing, so we can delve into explore the stream of concrete experience. So the idea of streaming reality is there, which is always already an impure and turbulent mixture of percepts, affects, and concepts, and that's straight from Deleuze-Guattari's What is Philosophy, and other types of experiential modes. And this would include things like, I would argue, daydreams, deja vu experiences, changes of altered states of consciousness, cinematic revelry, as we look at some carnivalesque experiences too. But these experiential modes, some of which haven't been theorized or haven't been fully theorized in contemporary times, are also part of that cluster of percepts, affects, and concepts, giving rise to a new type of streaming reality that we can participate in. I mentioned, and I will keep coming back to this, as opposed to, particularly in a time of austerity, arguing against finitude and arguing for the ideas of plentitude is risky, but I think it's a risk worth taking because we can find so many examples of the idea of not just the cornucopia, but this idea of pure becoming. We'll talk a little bit about heterogenesis and the creation of multiplicities arising in an unpredictable way out of unstable systems. Much of this has been theorized through the philosophy of Deleuze-Guattari, but also a bunch of the simultaneous works that are coming out, everything from mathematical modeling to different political systems that are coming out as a consequence of that too. But I'd like to foreground the idea of the cornucopia as a figure that is neither transcendent nor immanent, but as a harbinger perhaps of the idea of pure becoming, plentitude, richness of distribution, but also to some degrees unruly, a bit wild, deliberately incoherent, non-systematic. In many ways, the cornucopia, which talks about, I was talking with someone before the class about grotesque writing and things just coming out, and you figure out how to work them together later. That idea of the cornucopia as both richness, but also a flow of the discontinuous or flow of the non-identical. And the cornucopia as both a gestural figure, as you can see here on the right, those are actually seashell fragments from sands. And on the left, a work of an artist creating a cornucopia out of fabric. The medieval philosopher Averroes rejected the idea, and this is Kukonen's writings about plentitude. He rejected the idea of there being multiple possible worlds. He argued that they all exist, but in a deliberate sequence created by God, which is quite radical for the 1200s. He was an Islamic scholar writing in Andalusian Spain. The idea of the multiplicity of worlds, of the multiverse being lined up back into linear time, also seems to contradict some of our understandings of that distinction between aeon and chronos, between the two forms of time, one linear and one looping, one concerned with the present and one with an absent presence too. And he says that the man who affirms that before the world there was an infinite number of possibilities of worlds is certain to admit that before this world there was another world, and before this was second was a third, and so on ad infinitum. So this compression or this flattening of the multiverse into sequencing or series is not just a mathematical trick, I would call it, but also a fascinating way to think about this idea of plentitude as well, that it gets us back into understanding series, components, and set theory as being composed of different elements. And when we talk about field theory in a little bit, we'll see how when those are distributed spatially, even if it's in a chronological linear timeline, you still have a different form of plenitude that can arise, the heterogenesis systems. Kokonen also mentions in The Great Chain of Being an idea that Lovejoy proposed, and this was back in the 70s, I think. He called it the principle of plentitude. So that's where a lot of this resurgence of research is coming from. He gave it a single, deceptively simple formalization that no genuine possibility will ever remain unrealized. And what that means is if you can think it, it's already happened, or it's happening somewhere. And another way to think about that is possibility is always already realized the moment you recognize it as a possibility. So if you think of that monk or that artist poking their head through the boundary condition of the sphere or the limit condition of materialism and seeing another world, another state of consciousness, another possibility, it's already initiated those protocols and those processes. It's not simply an accident, but in many ways, there's a pivot point, or to use Badiou and Deleuze's highly charged term, an event can be that moment when this idea of possibility becomes actualized.
Thomas, sorry to interrupt. There's issues with the mic again.
Okay.
We can't hear everyone.
I'll keep trying. Differential heterogenesis is the idea that from a similar or identical condition, a variety of outcomes can arise. And you can see here in this very simple diagram from the book on heterogenesis, where different conditions or different permutations, you can say different flowers growing in a field can produce not just hybrids, but unexpected combinations arise as well too. In the book on differential heterogenesis by Sartre and others, the concern is in many ways a refutation perhaps of the Aristotelian model that there's only a fixed number of possibilities or a limited number of knowable outcomes available at the beginning of any situation or any state of play. Differential heterogenesis means that it's not simply the production of mutations or the appearance of the unexpected, but that each of these trajectories for the appearance of the unexpected have an influence on each other and create almost like a meta level of production and deviation too. And as a consequence, the differential heterogenesis can be mathematically modeled, but can't in any way be forecast. They mention in their book too that it's from a morphogenic perspective, a mathematical framework that envision the emergence of singular forms. But heterogenesis allows differential contrasts of quantitatively different kinds of different points of space and time. So this is also the idea of not just of plenitude, but mutation, difference, the appearance of monsters, perhaps. These constraints can then change in time, opening the possibility for new kinds of differential dynamics and the emergence of distinct entities and forms. And this is profoundly strange. This is the familiar producing the unfamiliar. This is the recognizable producing the unrecognizable. And in some ways, this is the constant churn and flux of what we heard before defined as multiplicity. The differential heterogenesis is not genesis in the biblical sense, where there's a very distinct, clearly defined structuralist relationship established in the Garden of Eden. We have a differential heterogenesis. You can think of it as layers of different ecologies at different time scales and different physical scales operating not just simultaneously, but producing reciprocating relationships between the different flows. One way to think about plenitude and to bring it into everyday life is to turn to the surrealist fetishization of the concept of the marvelous. This is a quasi-religious term. Miraculous and marvelous have similar connotations, at least in English, The marvelous was a term used by the surrealists to describe things that fell outside of the spectrum or the boundary conditions, the upper and lower thresholds of the everyday, and in some ways punctuated the bland equilibrium of everyday life and introduced strangeness, poetry, or wonder. As a device, the search for the marvelous became everything from party games, going out to markets and finding the most strange or the most surreal object you could in the thrift shop, to developing new forms of writing and new forms of collaborative practice that were intended to produce the unexpected. The marvelous became, it's almost like a fetish as well as a concept critical for surrealism. It's a metaphysical concept as well, which means it has a transcendent component. It is concerned with the ultimate meaning of reality. And surrealism begins with the rejection of reason and rationality as first principles of self and nature. Breton in the Surrealist Manifesto states, the marvelous is always beautiful. Anything marvelous is beautiful. In fact, only the marvelous is beautiful. And the connotation for marvelous would also contain things that are monstrous, unpredictable, unexpected, deviant. And he's using the word beautiful in almost a Platonic sense as well to describe something that was truthful, not simply as a category of aesthetic judgment in the Kantian sense, but very much moving against that. The strange becomes fascinating as a consequence of this revelation or this experience of it, particularly if it's moved out of context. Louis Aragon also said the marvelous is the eruption of contradiction within the real. So we talked before about weeds being flowers out of place, or elements in the set being deranged from their original standing position. The eruption of contradiction within the real is that crack, that fissure, that gap, that unexpected moment, that strange little phenomena that you can't stop responding to, that starts to challenge or at least recognize the boundary or limit conditions of the real itself by proposing something outside of the real. They experience the marvelous as a kind of jolt or shock, right? You can think of it as being zapped, an excitingly disorienting sensation. Again, derangement is the basis for the marvelous, as though a crack had suddenly opened in the world's carapace and normality and everything else was slipping away. And this is the surrealist fantasy of the real dissolving into the dream world. Because Breton also defined that in the Surrealist Manifesto, that surrealism is the fusion of dream and reality, not a binary of one or the other, but something that's somewhere between a waking state and a dreaming state. So the everyday marvelous, whether it's in the various paintings of medieval figures in contemporary guise, or the search for forms of demonstration and display of the marvelous, as you can see here in Couture's book about Duchamp, Dali, and other types of surrealist exhibitions that were done to shock people and to signal jam or short circuit their cognitive apparatuses and give them direct access to their unconscious through jarring, aesthetically deviant, or in many ways unexpected spatial encounters. There's something to be said about the relationship between cognition and interiority of the self and the interior space of the exhibition, the double interiority, I call it, of surrealism. There's a correlation between the enclosed interior space where the exhibitions work their magic or operate in a machinic way to liberate parts of the subconscious and make them evident to the conscious. So you can think of surrealist art as the reverse of psychoanalysis that way. This is a painting, a reconstruction of Dali painting some of his own works in the exhibition. It is at the World Expo, his Pavilion of Venus, where he took some of his own iconography of his earlier paintings and put that on the panel as well to talk about this dissolution or this diffusion of the real in the face of this real possibility. These dreamscapes that recall both the Catalan landscapes he grew up in, as well as some of the fascinating and erotic and horrific figures, burning giraffes, headless torsos, and clocks melting as time itself becomes liquid. All of these tropes that appear in Dali's high period of surrealist works are all attempts to excavate, and he talks about very clearly when he developed the paranoid critical method, which is both ties to critique and critical theory, as well as the operative forces of paranoia or madness as a design tool, as an artistic creation tool. The Everyday Marvelous was this breaking of the mirror, the breaking of the fourth wall between the real and what is either repressed in psychoanalysis or what is partially revealed and remains with us as a lingering feeling as you wake up from the dream state and try to hold on to those last fragments. And is no less than Paul Feyerabend, the philosopher of science, who got in those great debates with Emil Lakatosh about whether science was a religion or not, in his provocative and I think underrated book Against Method. We had to read this as PhD students, and this one really changed my entire attitude towards scholarly research. In Against Method, he says we need a dream world in order to discover the features of the real world we think we inhabit. There's also a corollary of that, perhaps, in the work of Giacometti, where he says the function of art, if I remember correctly, the function of art is to create a reality that is equal or greater than the one that we have. Right? So how have you thought about this? How can the dream world initiate derangement or madness in reality? We've looked at some surreal examples, and we've looked at some spiritual and cosmological models. But again, this might be a rhetorical question. One of the things I would hope you would get from this seminar is the ability to, dare and to risk more, and to think about this idea of the dream world, which is showing up even in philosophy of science, as we saw in Feyerabend, to initiate derangement. And derangement being, that first stage or that recognition that madness is an option. Feel free to type in chat if you have any insights, or if you already got experience initiating derangement or madness from your dream world.
I don't. Sorry, may I?
Yes.
Hello. Yeah. I don't know if this necessarily applies, but I was talking to a friend, and I think this happens to a lot of people, where she saw in her dream that she was wearing a hijab, and she doesn't wear it in real life. She decided to wear it after it appeared in several of her dreams.
Oh, that's interesting. So in some ways, the dream was the future pushing into the present.
Yeah, I guess it became kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy or something.
Yeah, it's a sign. There is a strong belief in a lot of the ancient Greeks. The dreams were actually communications from the gods before there was a development of the idea of the psychoanalytic, repression systems, and the subconscious is trying to get revenge by speaking in dreams. And that oneric principle that things in dreams have to be articulated as divine speech. You find that even in Nietzsche's book The Birth of Tragedy, which is actually a book about the death of tragedy, but where he talks about the god Apollo as opposed to the Dionysian. Dionysian being, as the frenzied, hyperactive, prolific, drunken revelry and excess, and the Apollonian being the calm, cool, reserved, thoughtful, but also dream-based, because in the Apollonian system, Apollo used to give oracles, and he would present visions of the future, usually by they would have to drop virgins from a tripod into this vent in a volcano, and they'd come out hallucinating, and they'd transcribe what they said, and that became work as a future too. So there's always that in classical thought that dreams are garbled signals from the gods about what's coming. And it's only, when the instrumentalization of dreams and within the larger project, is Jonathan Crary in his book 24/7, capitalist appropriation of sleep, even leading to cognitive capitalism. Where we have to monetize our dreams and our free time and become our own micromanagers. The idea that sleep itself becomes this area of rebellion against control systems, but also, if you think about it as something strange in a dream. Do you have recurring dreams, for example? I always ask, when I was teaching a course on surrealism, when I took attendance, I would always tell the students, I wouldn't ask them for their name and ID. I'd be like, tell me a dream that you recently had. And it was shocking to me how vivid some people's recall of their dreams are too. But if you think about it as oneric, or you think about it as a of fume coming off of a repression system, what are the other ways of derangement that come through dreams too? Are there dreams that are indescribable? Are there dreams that stay with you all day, but you've lost the actual details? Are there dreams that only occur, during a certain period of your life? Or I shouldn't tell you this, but I've been a professor a long time, and I still have nightmares about having to go take an exam for a class I never went to, and showing up either, in a towel or a bathrobe or nothing, and being handed an exam in a language I can't read. And I'm like, wait, I'm a professor in a PhD. I don't want to take this exam. And they're like, no, you missed all the classes. You have to take it. And I sit there in my dreams and I argue. I'm like, no, I'm an established scholar. And I still have these nightmares of having to take an exam decades later too. So I think there's something to the idea of derangement coming from not just something being out of place, but the fact that, like Jung was talking about synchronicity, it's not just the oddity of it or the strangeness, but that you start to ascribe meaning to it. And that initiates a process that is quite significant as well too. Derangement is not the end. Derangement is a heightened sensitivity that leads towards other things too. I just want you to think about this. We'll come back to this, particularly in the third and fourth talks, and maybe even in some of your final projects can come back to this idea, the idea of conditioning forms of madness or derangement. I mentioned my my invention of the word post-medieval, but it's not. There's actually a really cool journal called Post-Medieval that was started by a group of, I think, the same group that started the Punctum Press, some queer medievalists that were interested in doing things differently. And that's the group that published that essay that I posted of mine called Medieval Surrealism. Arabate, who's a well-known Lacanian scholar of French critical theory, in his fascinating book, The Future of Theory, is published by Blackwell probably a decade ago, does a very surrealist thing. And he says, if you take all the surrealist writings about hysteria, which they saw as a very powerful tool for signal jamming or short-circuiting rationalism and seeing other states of awareness and consciousness, it says if you take the words hysteria and just replace it with theory, that it still works. And it was like, that's primitive and brilliant at the same time. And then he goes and elaborates this entire book trying to argue that, ontologically, that theory and hysteria are interchangeable and therefore identical. And that's a very medieval thing too, I would argue. Working through a logical system and doing with semiotic change too. Theory never stops coming, right? Just like the ghosts of hysteria, right? Seduction, wonder, desire, jouissance. All of this is part of this fascinating book. And I think I put about 4 pages in there. There's 2 pages about hysteria that I put on the readings, and 2 pages about the idea of revelation. And you'll see that has something to do with some of the things we've discussed already. So you could also do this, replace hysteria with theory, or as I would propose doing nowadays, as I read theory, I'm like, we need more hysteria. We need less scientific precision. So I'm kind of doing a retrograde thing, I think, with this course too. And so let's flip the pancake back for a minute and see what happens. In Holsinger, I've also put a reading on there, a couple of pages. He calls it the pre-modern condition, which is poking fun at Lyotard's postmodern condition and arguing that all French critical theory is basically regurgitated medievalism. And I remember when I was studying philosophy, Jacques Derrida, came and gave a lecture at Emory University's philosophy program, and one of the professors said, nothing he said is original. You can find all of it in medieval philosophy. And everyone's like, yeah, but that's what philosophy does. In this one, the parts I put, it was specifically about Bataille and his references to the Summa of Aquinas, the Summa Theologia. And I'm just mentioning that, in this text as well, medievalism and the making of theory, that there is such a strong influence of medieval thought in the postmodern. Again, it's a retro medievalism, but also a post-medievalism, if you're interested in those kind of temporal tags, because a lot of what was established in modernism and structuralism starts to be unwoven through these different, very selective approaches towards medievalism. Yeah, regurgitated Baroque. that would be, two forms of plenitude at different scales superimposed on each other as a chat comment. And yeah, Peter Greenaway being a good example, a Baroque postmodern filmmaker that I got to work with these European guys. We'll turn to Foucault, who, as I discovered, is cited more often than God is. So Foucault now has an H index bigger than God, which is pretty terrifying. But in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, man's dispute with madness was a dramatic debate about the powers of the world. Madness was clouded by images of the will of God, the beast, and the system, and all the marvelous secrets of knowledge. So his first publications that came out were looking at the institutionalization of madness and going back. And you may know one of Foucault's earlier techniques, a genealogical technique, which he later abandoned, of going through historic texts and find out when words originated, when they came into popular usage, when they were first used, which he later abandoned after he discovered Nietzsche in the middle of writing the Order of Things. One of the consequences of this is, if we look at his book, The Order of Things, this is a diagram showing, the schematic articulation of, I guess, the knowledge system that was dominant in Enlightenment culture. Again, 17th, 18th centuries. 16th century would be Baroque. 17th would be maybe some Baroque moving into Romanticism. 18th century is clearly moving into the Enlightenment period. And you can start to see that taxonomies, nomenclature, and he's talking about obviously Diderot, encyclopedia. But in these fascinating diagrams that are coming out of his text, his analysis is quite comprehensive at that time of the epistemic center, the epistemological basis for knowledge systems in a post-medieval world. In the 19th century, we can start to see, as you see in this diagram, movements towards articulation, derivation, designation, attribution. It's starting to sound both the philosophy and epistemological are starting to sound both scientific and more linguistic too, as opposed to the 20th century. But there's no such diagram that I found for his earlier work on the medieval and the origins of madness in the medieval too. I'm just going to throw this out here because I'm being brave today. I'm very happy to share this completely rejected conference paper proposal I wrote last month for the International Medieval Congress in Kalamazoo, Michigan, where all the medievalists come together and decide apparently who's a medievalist and who's not. I'm not. I just wanted to share this here because those are really problems too. Looking at machines of love and grace, spiritual machines, Gnostic cybernetics, reality chunking into lambda, technological non-holism in Rodin, and then of course P.K. Biggs Vallis. This is the kind of weird stuff I write. This one just kind of came out of me in about 10 minutes. Not that I can do this regularly, but this kind of stuff just pours out of me. So there's something about that cornucopia approach where absorbing a variety of incommensurate. And does anyone here have like multiple books open at different places? And you just kind of go from book to book, or you kind of like sit down and read the text? If you're in the first category, you're more like I do, and they start to resonate and talk to each other behind your back and start to conspire and have perverse influences on what you're doing. It's a very nonlinear system. So that's how this actual abstract works. Very briefly in the time we have left, we mentioned the definition of surrealism as psychic automatism in its pure state, by which one proposes to express verbally by means of the written word or any other matter the actual functioning of thought. So the original intention of surrealism under Baton was to actually get into the real thinking process. And this is why for him psychoanalysis was such a rich tool, because in many ways it got rid of that little Kantian judge and editor in your head and allowed you to directly access the stream of consciousness. Dali took this to an extreme. This is from that little essay that I posted as one of the required reading for this class, which also that required reading also took me about half an hour. It just came out after about 6 months of procrastinating it. It just showed up, and I threw some footnotes in it, but you get ready. So this is from that text. And I was wondering, I said, this sounds familiar. It's like, oh yeah, I wrote this. Salvador Dali takes this to the extreme when he states, I believe the moment is at hand. Dali, when by a process of thought, which is active and paranoid in character, it will be possible to systematize systematize confusion and to contribute to the total discredit of the world of reality. So here he's echoing in some ways Rimbaud with the derangement of the senses and the systematic reorganization of the senses. Here he's systematizing confusion. He is attempting to signal jam all forms of reality. In some ways, he's not just changing reality or altering it. He's making it as deranged as possible. And he talks about it as a paranoid as opposed to a schizophrenic approach, which for him often involved different types of everything from his obsession with the base elements of life to his repudiation of many of the dominant forms of orthodoxy and heteronormative conditions he was opposed to. Christianity he was opposed to, although he later reconciled with Christianity. It's like the old joke about, what are you protesting? And the guy goes, what do you got? That was, I think, Dali's approach as he developed the paranoid critical method. And this is referring to Hajick's work, which we'll look at in a minute, subjective investigation. This was a kind of a research project I had proposed years ago that I think I'm now starting to do, actually through this class as well, which will hopefully next year become a book. Enigmas emerging from enigmas into a cascade of fallen angels, the combine and condense figures of thought with the thought itself. Medieval qualities were the rough tectonics and the subversion of rational functionalism through transcendent narrative and powerful projection. This is my take on how the surreal as a set of strategies and practices operating in mid-century modernism also in strong ways recalls medieval sources. Medieval bodies, texts, and images are but incomplete evidence of the lure of other worlds of fascination, waiting like condensation to appear on the surfaces of this world. So this is that idea of the strange, or the flower out of place. To appear on the surface of this world, fevers, obsessions, possession, including spirit possession, madness, and the emergence of subsequent romanticism, conscious, all exposed as a system. And I mentioned Foucault here and his absurd Chinese encyclopedia. Either dividing line or distinction between the surreal and non-surreal medieval works might be less useful than the sympathetic resonance and fertile possibilities of the respective contamination and fusion of the real and imagined. As surrealism presupposes, surrealist thought is projected backwards. Again, we've seen a diagram of that. As medieval thoughts are projected forward, the rational will condense clearly, and I think in that friction between intersection, interpenetration, transmutation are developed, not given, between medieval worlds. The mixture, again, this is the idea of not just the metalepsis, but the syncretism, the combining of the unfamiliar or the discontinuous, incommensurate, the mixture of classes and societies and commerce and exchange of realities, the formative and legible aesthetics, ruins of medieval buildings or the medieval world, and that's what got the tie started in, because the monstrous is the fabric of everyday life, and the function of monster theory is to defamiliarize the familiar, creating errant, deformed, and uncanny doubles, often of our own making and doing. And this is from Aristotle himself, talking about when strange things emerge or the unpredictable happens. He goes back to Diogenes. He says that there's actually reciprocal action for these things to happen. He says, for it's not heat and cold that change into one another, but clearly it is a substratum. So there's the idea, Aristotle has the idea that there's a substrate. So things that change from one state to the other have in common, not a unity, but an invisible substrate. Unlike a pleroma or a transcendental realm above, there's an invisible secret field beneath the self-evident or the material, where things start to emerge that can change their state or become differentiated. It says in those things that are action and passion necessary, their substrate and nature must be one. It's not that everything is potentially anything, but things that change have something in common if they're changing in relationship to each other. So this is actually quite interesting because it's an attempt to create a unity from a field that's a differentiated field. It's a beginning of a systems building from incommensurate, uncountable, or unknowable elements. So we can find that idea, and we'll talk in one of the lectures a lot more about chimeras. This is El Lissitzky's exhibition poster. He's drawing on a very common medieval image of the two figures with the shared eye, and repurposing this as a demonstration of the heroic new Soviet architecture coming out of Russia. And this is his exhibition that he did in 1929 in Switzerland and Germany as he left Russia, to show the then Russian avant-garde practices to the rest of the world, which in many ways look like the West too. But El Lissitzky and most of the Russian avant-garde, Malevich perhaps being the most extreme case, were all well versed in medieval iconography and medieval theology. In the Orthodox tradition, as they developed these new languages and vocabularies, they dipped very heavily into, as you can see, this uncanny image of the two that are one. Claude Cahun, who's an American surrealist who often used photographs of himself to create works of art. There's been a revival of interest in her work in the last 10, 15 years. Great scholarship coming in and around her questions of bending and distorting her identity, creating what I was mentioning in that essay about doppelgangers of ourselves, working also with this medieval configuration of two versions of the same self, the uncanny double, the homunculus. There's a lot of varieties of the self becoming alien, or the unrecognizable alien in yourself becoming materialized or having interaction with you, which is a fundamental theological principle as well, but also in Gnosticism, the idea that there was an alien God and there's a benevolent God, and they're both fighting for attention too. That gets reproduced in the subconscious of a lot of these surrealist practices, particularly in the field of photography. Rosalind Krauss wrote some great books early in her career about how this works in surrealist photography. Daniel Lee's Manimal, an early attempt to work with morphing and to try to, I look at this, and I remember I was being shocked by this when this first came out, and now, as you know, you can get AI generated faces of people that don't exist, which probably can be used to gamify a lot of facial recognition and identification systems too. But here you can see it's very common in medieval drawings. I don't have an example here, but you can find them, of caricatures of characters and people, and they would show someone with bird-like qualities and do a drawing of a bird next to it to make it very obvious as well. So this idea of this, partially incorporated alien other. And when we talk about the whole class about chimeras coming up, when we talk about that, there's a genetic basis of chimeras, but there's also a medieval interpretation of the classical hybrid, where chimeras are actually composed of three and not two, that we'll talk about at great length as being a type of alternative to the singular unified body that has a continuous, persistent essence and object permanence. And I think what was going to be much more exciting was to take out those elements, you called it in Deleuzian terms, the differential heterogenesis. You can also call them transformers. This is Darcy Thompson, his book on origin growth of forms from the early 20th century, arguing mathematically that all fish are variations of the same fish shape, as you can imagine, something that precedes a lot of the sophisticated digital work allows us to do experiments in topology and morphology. And this was all hand-drawn back then, but looking for mathematical transformations in biological organisms, which is also tied to mutation, to chimeras, and to monster theories. This is my colleague. I just grabbed this. I haven't asked his permission. I hope I don't get in trouble. This is Phil Watson in the EO Free School of Architecture of Botana. He's doing a strange AI-generated mutations of very conventional images of different biological forms, as well as you can see medieval structures. And in the last bit of time we have left, to very quickly talk about, in that essay that I wrote, two references that I like to highlight, and we can come back to these later. The first, very significant for me, is Bosch's painting of the Garden of Earthly Delights, which is actually a counter-genesis. It's an alternative model, according to Botting and others, of what the Garden of Eden would be like if man didn't eat the forbidden fruit and they lived in a world without sin. That's one interpretation of this very enigmatic painting. The other thing I noticed are these quasi-alchemical plant-machine hybrids, these soft machines configured in a perfect square with a sphere at the center, a very common mystical element, not just the square of opposition, but the geometries of the landscape itself are very highly determinist, whereas the movements of the people become these discrete and autonomous fascination scenes of different gods. On the back of the painting, and I got to go to Spain finally and see this painting this past summer, the back of the painting, it closes up into a triptych that shows, it's called the third day of creation. And so the back of it shows the world right before the creation of it, as you can see here, in the empty state. And this is a ultraviolet poster that I would like to get one day. This is not Bosch on acid, but this is the ultraviolet interpretation of Bosch is seen as one of the quintessential medieval surrealists. But his machines also, this is a reading I've done from my work with EGS, is that these strange devices that are both plant, organic, inorganic, and machine-like that contain elements from alchemical operations as well as mythical geometries. These soft machines are actually, I would argue, terraformers. You can think of the explicit terraformers that you find in a lot of science fiction films being introduced in the Garden of Eden would have to have something like a terraforming process happening too. There's not too much time to cover this, but we'll come back to it, the idea of the expanded field, and you can see that four-square diagram as well. This is from Rosen and Krauss, Sculpturing the Expanded Field Essay from the October publication, where she looks at the relationship between landscape architecture, not architecture, and landscape. So that's a conventional square of oppositions, and how these things configure to create an expanded field, which is a conceptual operation of a type of practice or a set of conditions or operations in a field condition that are moving far beyond the boundaries for the limit conditions of actual forms. And just the last element we'll talk about, Stan Allen and field conditions takes this idea to an extreme. You can see Mondrian, chaos theory. I forget what the third one is. The fourth one is the Mosque Cathedral of Cordoba, which also got to see the summit, a fascinating field condition. And the one on the right is a herding condition, and before and after of a herd swarming together. And these types of field conditions, which are no longer geometric but process-based, have really risen in terms of their, not just their understanding, but their ability to be used in creative processes with the development, the simultaneous development of digital representation, algorithmic and genetic design processes too. The other sources, Hayek published on his angel catchers, his angel machines, and these are some of the, Jim Williamson constructed these with the NEH grant, a couple of his designs, where he creates these carnival-esque field conditions. And at that, I'm going to skip ahead. So in the few moments we have left, I just want to let you know, next week we don't have class. The week after, we'll leave a generous amount of time for group presentations. 1 to 3 students per group, I would prefer. Select the text. Now, for each week, I've listed a required text and then about 8 or 9 short little excerpts for the curious. Feel free to be unconventional. You're welcome to pick any of the required texts to work with. If you have a work that resonates with one of them, feel free to blend them. If you find one of the secondary texts to be interesting or relevant, have at it. Some of those are only 2 pages long, by the way, so the reading list looks much more extensive than it is. I would prefer if you could do it as pre-recorded. I think most people like that better, but it's more work for you. So I would prefer if we could do that, because you do have 2 weeks, but there is a Thanksgiving break coming up. Also, if you want to do live presentations, a very capable moderator, Matthias, will help me coordinate and figure out how to sort people into doing those and to do your best. But I'd like you to just detail any medieval or post-human attributes in your own words that you find in some of these texts. When I was doing my PhD, one of the professors tipped me off and said, "We're not interested in what you see in the text. we're interested in you echoing what we see in the texts. And I said, when I'm a professor, I'm never going to be that way. So I don't want you to agree with me on anything, because one of us becomes redundant. I want you to tell me what, if anything, you see that you find interesting or provocative, and bring that to the group in your presentation. Does that make sense? That sound doable? Just feel free to reach out. I've got a new center email address, and I'll try to get on the Discord tonight. I think there's a Discord channel set up for the class. So yeah, just be chatty or be nosy. Don't disappear if it sounds weird. Come back, and I will do everything I can to help you sort that out. But we do have group presentations expected 14 days from now, and if you can pre-record them, that would be great. And then later on, at the end of the semester, at the end of the course, final projects, I think they're due about 2 weeks after. I think that's actually right around New Year's. I will be as slack as the new center allows me to be in receiving these. And I'll have to find out what that means in terms of actually a hard deadline. But I would like you to do something, and I'll just show you an example. And this is in the quick syllabus I typed up too. Instead of doing a photo essay, I'd like you to try something called a diagrammatic essay. You notice I use a lot of diagrams, and I use diagrams as a way to sort things out and to clarify complexity. The most powerful thing you can do in a diagram is leaving things out that are not important. Diagrams are great tools of negation. And so to think about that, and then anchor it with a 2 to 3 page text document combining relevant concepts introduced in the course. But you can also include personal narrative or exegesis of the diagram. So it can be a theory fiction as well. So this is a type of experimental diagram plus theory fiction. It should look something like that. And I haven't put those in one image, but you kind of get the idea. It's a medieval manuscript with some text being illustrated, and in the beautiful margins and glossia of the medieval text, you have other hands contradicting what's being said in the text too. So this palimpsest becomes quite rich. You can see some erased images. But I think your final project should be interesting to you and provocative. So it's got a diagram in it. You can make a diagram, you can collage a diagram, you can find a diagram. I'm not fussy about that. And then you kind of contextualize it with words. And the thing we learned in design school, and most designers don't know this, it's not the organization of the text on the sheet that makes you a designer. It's the arrangement of the blank spaces that makes you a designer. So think about that. We'll come back in the third class. I will leave the last third with more examples, and we'll talk you through this. Because I would love you to do something and say, this is the strangest thing I've ever done for the new center. And that's a high bar to cross. And say, this is what I did for that wacky class. And I don't even know what it means, but this is what I think it means. And I would say, I'm so proud of you. All right? Okay. At that point, I am going to stop sharing and stop talking. My voice is going. I think we still got 7 minutes on the clock. Ask me questions. I get paid by each answer I give. So need some of that crowdfunding money. Have at it.
Oh, may I? Yeah. So I was thinking about something. So we talked about kind of different, I don't know to call them temporalities or conceptions of time or experiences of time or ways time can work. But I'm wondering, those of them which do correlate to the medieval or post-medieval period, I guess I'd like to know what you think makes them post-medieval. Like, is there something of the post-medieval, shall we say, I don't know, like social configuration, which is echoed in these structures? How do you think does it work?
Yeah, no, it's very complex because you'll find in a lot of the dualist transcendental models 2 notions of time, one for the earth and one for God, right? There's eternity and then there's clocks. And that's an oversimplification we talked about. You'll find in a lot of post-human literature and science fiction, the future shaping the present, like the reversal of flows. And so you might one way to think about post-medieval is it's not post-modern and medieval, it's post-human and medieval, which is probably the era we're in. But there's also, and I haven't mentioned it, I'm not an expert in this, but I'm fascinated with, if you look at the idea of like Escobar's pluriverse, and I think he talks a little bit about, studying cybernetics, but realizing actually, oh, that's all indigenous knowledge, just he went and learned it differently too. So there's everything from a lot of scholarship now about subjective time, Coletti's work, people looking at quantum theories of time and trying to expand that into social relationships, Barad and some of the others in the new materialists doing that. There's actually so many potentially rich and fascinating models of chronology or temporality available. And then I think that in some ways we're often forced to blend or combine them. Bergson argued very much for the idea of duration as a type of not just subjective time, but something that almost creates a kind of a pool of time within other pools of time at different scales. And Proust tried to demonstrate that in his book. But you can also think of different rates of acceleration. I remember studying simple things, you'll know this, like in relativity theory. And the two brothers and different planets and the clocks move differently too. So I guess if anything, the politics of time in some ways presumes a social relationship, I would argue, as opposed to generates a social relationship. So that if you agree that New Center Zoom invite calendar time is the correct time, or I'll get to it when I feel like it, or when I was in Mexico, mañana time, or here Indian stretchable time, that's a thing. It means I'm aware of the deadline, but I'm in charge, and it'll happen when it happens. So this idea of temporality itself, whether it's a useful tool, but it presupposes, as I said, there's a social arrangement, I think, that precedes the temporality. And in Bakhtin, I mentioned a little bit about the carnivalesk. We'll come back to the carnivalesk because I had to cut it short. But the idea of the chronotope, that each novel actually has its own model of time. So every novel you read is actually teaching you a new way to model time. It's a very old idea as well. And he gets that actually from the Renaissance. Okay. Moderator, hand up. Yes.
No, just because we are getting short on time, I just wanted to go back really quick on the technical aspects of the presentations.
Yeah, help me out here.
Which make up for like 30% of the final grade. The rest is attendance, participation in final work. I can send all the details in the chat so you have them without me explaining much further. But for the presentation, I will just put like a document on which you can put your name. And also, like, if you want to be in a group, you can specify and put your email so you can like self-organize your own groups. Else, you can also do it alone, but if you prefer doing it in groups, I think this is a good way to proceed. And also, we've been experiencing some issues with the sound. It seems to be a network issue with some of the people, but I would suggest for our next session, we have like headphones on hand so that if anyone have an issue, they can just put it in the chat and we can like try to switch device if that's good by you.
Yeah, that's good. Okay, in the last minutes, so yeah, usually the presentations and the schedules and things like that are pretty well set, and you guys have more familiarity with it than I do. I'm very grateful that you've come and you've attended and stayed. This is, a type of madness that I'm still starting to untangle. It will be a book project next year. And today we've only laid the substrate for very particular forms of derangement and madness. So it's going to get weirder. And so thank you for coming along so far. And with that, I will stop speaking. I will say goodbye to everyone and thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.